Okay. So you want me to leave this up here?
What's that?
Can I leave this up here
Yeah,
for you?
perfect. With programming them.
Just a quick hello to those joining on Zoom. We expect to start the program at 3 or maybe a couple minutes after, so get comfortable. Two things you should do is make sure your audio is where you want it to be. If you can hear my voice, you're all set. If not, check whatever device you're using, earbuds or whatever, and make sure everything is plugged in correctly and the volume is set right on your laptop or computer. So thank you for joining us. Also today, as in the past, for those on Zoom, we will be eagerly awaiting your questions, which should be submitted using the QA feature. So either at the top or the bottom of your screen, you'll see QA. If you click on that, you can type in a question at any time during the program. We will hold all questions for the end. So as I said, we'll start the program 3 or a couple minutes after. Get yourself comfortable, get a glass of water. We'll be back to you soon. And in just 1 minute. Just waiting for some last minute arrivals to get their seats here at the Hingham Heritage Museum. And I hear a few others just coming up the steps right now. For our Zoom audience that may have just joined, please check where you see the QA button on your Zoom screen. That's where you can enter a question at any time during today's program, and we will hold all questions until the end of the prepared remarks by Professor Taylor. Still more coming in, so just bear with us another minute or so. Please come up front, their seat. Okay, we are about to begin our program. Good afternoon. My name is Eileen McIntyre. We can stop the slide share, Sarah. My name is Eileen McIntyre. I'm chair of the Education Committee for the Hingham Historical Society. Welcome to the first program in the Hingham Historical Society's 2022-2023 lecture series, Native Homelands, Settler Colonialism. We will hear first from Deirdre Anderson, Executive Director of the Hingham Historical Society, for her welcome. Deirdre?
Thank you, Eileen. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Hingham Historical Society's 2022-2023 lecture series, Native Homelands, Settler Colonialism. My name is Deirdre Anderson, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Hingham Historical Society. And I welcome those of you who are joining us in our headquarters at the Hingham Heritage Museum and all of you who are joining us online. Today, we launch our 5th annual lecture series, and it is an honor to kick off this inquiry into the important intersection of Indigenous history and centuries of English settlement with a world-class group of researchers who have so generously given their time and talent to us. Before we begin today's program, I want to give thanks and share an upcoming programming note. Sincere thanks to our Education Committee, chaired by Eileen McIntyre and represented today by Ruth Gilbert Whitner, Jane Shute, Kathy Curley, Lara Thompson, and our newest member, Judith Brooks, who have brought this series to light, and to Society Assistant Director Sarah Doggett, who dove in head first to manage the logistics, and to Colin McGinnis, who makes the magic happen with the technology. Now a programming note. Next month, we kick off the 2022 Hingham History Fund with our fourth Tavern Night at Old Ordinary. We invite those of you who are local to join us on Saturday night, October 15th, under the tent at our 1686 House Museum to toast 100 years of society stewardship of the building with beer, small bites, and live music. Tickets can be purchased on our website. As a private nonprofit, we are dependent not only on annual membership, but also on philanthropic support to steward our properties, our collections, and maintain robust programming like you will enjoy today. In the last few months of every year, we ask for your philanthropic support, and I thank you in advance for considering us in your giving plans. It's an honor to join with you today to hear from Pulitzer Prize winner Alan Taylor. And to introduce Alan, I turn to our Education Committee Chair and Board Member Eileen McIntyre.
Thank you, Deirdre. And it is my distinct pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Alan Taylor. the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Foundation Professor of History at the University of Virginia. Alan is joining us today live on screen from Charlottesville, Virginia. Professor Taylor has written extensively about the British North American colonies and the early American Republic. Among other recognitions, his work has twice been honored with a Pulitzer Prize for History. Of particular relevance to the subject matter of this lecture series is Alan's 2006 book titled The Divided Ground: Indians, Settlers, and the Northern Borderland of the American Revolution. In 2007, this work received the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic Book Prize, as well as the Society of the Cincinnati Triennial Cox Book Prize. Professor Taylor is no stranger to New England. He was born in Portland, Maine, and received his undergraduate degree from Colby College. Later, Alan received his Ph.D. in American history at Brandeis University. He taught in the history department at Boston University from 1987 to 1994, before moving on to a 20-year stay at the University of California at Davis, and then in 2014 to his current position at the University of Virginia. Thank you, Alan, for agreeing to launch this series, and welcome to our virtual stage at the Hingham Historical Society this afternoon. Alan.
Thank you very much, Eileen. That's a very kind introduction. I want to thank you and Deirdre and Sarah for all of your help in arranging this. I guess I should go to share screen now, or do you do it at your end? I guess I do it.
You can just enable your share screen, Alan.
Okay. How does that look? Can you see the slides all right?
They look great.
Okay, thank you very much. And I want to thank all of you who have joined for these sessions. It's a very important topic in that we are all living with the legacy of the conquest of North America and the ongoing interpenetration of native and settler life on this continent. And I'm honored to be part of this series. I can tell you that the other speakers in this series are very distinguished and very articulate, and you'll learn a great deal from them. I have, as Eileen mentioned, written a book called The Divided Ground, and it's about the ways in which land becomes divided and the impact of this on Native peoples. The particular Native peoples I'm focused on are the Haudenosaunee. Sometimes they're called the Iroquois, but the Haudenosaunee is the term they prefer for themselves. And they were, in the 18th century, a cluster of 6 nations. So often they were called the 6 Nations. They included the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, Tuscarora, and the Seneca. And that's roughly going from east to west, with the Seneca located near the Niagara River, and the Mohawks, the holders of the eastern door of this confederation, and they were a confederation of 6 nations. That eastern door is in the Mohawk Valley. Now, the person who is looking at you here, other than me, is General Frederick Haldimand, who was the governor of Canada, a military governor, as you can see from his uniform, a British man, as you can see from his uniform. And Britain had been defending Canada, which included all of the country around the Great Lakes, with essential assistance from Indian allies, including the Haudenosaunee 6 Nations. But in the spring of 1783, Haldimand receives what is for him terrible news of a peace treaty made by the British Empire with the new United States, recognizing the United States and granting it very generous boundaries. As indicated here, the darkish brown area shows areas that were pretty securely settled by American citizens. The lighter beige area represents territories that were primarily under Native American control, and those Native Americans were allied to the British. During the war, the Native Americans had been very successful at attacking American settlements and defending their own homelands. So that it came as a great shock to Haldeman, the terms of the peace treaty, which is all of that beige area, which had been more in native control and natives allied with the British, all of that has been granted to the new United States, making the northern boundary of the United States the Great Lakes, and the western boundary at that time, the Mississippi River. So this is just shocking to Haldeman. Because why have the negotiators done this? Why have they betrayed the British forces and their Indian allies? And the natives who are especially affected by this are the Haudenosaunee. Here is a map from the time showing the Six Nations country, which is centered in the Finger Lakes region of upstate New York, now upstate New York. And so suddenly Native peoples have been cast on the American side of the border when most of the Haudenosaunee had been fighting as British allies during the war. And they do not expect kind treatment from the victorious Americans. So the Haudenosaunee people, and here's an image from the very early 19th century that shows an Oneida family, a man on the right and two women with their children, two children, one each on the back of a woman and then another child tagging along. And this is a pretty good representation of the sorts of people who belong to the Haudenosaunee. At the start of the war, there were about 9,000 to 10,000 people in the Six Nations. By the end of the war, it's probably closer to 7,000. And they're very anxious about the future of their homelands, which have been put on the American side of the border. And they are quite blunt in telling British officers at the forts around the Great Lakes, forts that had been in British hands and are now assigned to being in the American territory, that this treaty is unjust to them, that they are free people subject to no power on earth, that they were faithful allies of the King of England, but not his subjects. They had no right whatsoever to grant away to the states of America their rights or properties. And Haldeman's upset about this because he promised the Haudenosaunee throughout the war that he was going to defend their homelands for them and that they would never be sacrificed to the Americans. So he writes this in private back to a friend in Britain, and he's just ashamed of what British negotiators have done in betraying the Six Nations and other native allies of the British. Now, native peoples were used to thinking about the British forts in their midst, like Fort Niagara in Western New York, as their assets as well as British. So they're not threatened by the British forts. What they're threatened by is the prospect that the British are going to turn these forts over to the Americans. Because the native peoples had developed a successful alliance with the British, who gave them annual presents of trade goods, who armed them so that they can go out hunting and so they can defend their homelands against American expansion. So what you're seeing here is a group of native peoples outside a British-held fort. You can see the flag there. Some of the native peoples are actually wearing red coats that have been given to them by British military officers. And the native peoples are firing their guns in the air, not in any kind of threat, but this was a salute of respect that they welcome these British forts in their midst. And they're extremely upset at the prospect that the British are going to turn these forts over to the Americans. So what they do, though, is they threaten the British. They say, if you withdraw from these forts, when you start to withdraw, we'll attack you because we expect you to hang on to these forts. We expect you not to honor the treaty. This is very sobering for British military officers. Many of them had served in North America back in the 1760s when there had been an Indian rebellion around the Great Lakes known as Pontiac's Rebellion to the British, named after a particular native chief from a nation to the west, the Ottawa. And Pontiac and other allied nations allied with Pontiac and his people had risen up and they destroyed British garrisons because they were dissatisfied with their treatment during the early 1760s. And so Native peoples are reminding the British that you're only in this country with our permission, and you've violated our alliance by threatening to give these forts to the Americans. And we've not given them permission to take these forts. So this puts Haldeman in a spot. What's he going to do? And he decides on his own authority that he will hang on to the forts and reject American emissaries who've come to receive the forts. Now, this is pretty extraordinary because Haldeman is under orders from London to turn over these forts to the American emissaries because of the peace treaty. And Haldeman says, I'm not going to do that. And he writes to explain that if he does this, it's going to bring on an Indian war that will be devastating to British soldiers and to the settlers of Canada. And he persuades his home government that, in fact, they ought to reconsider this peace treaty. Now, the British don't renounce the peace treaty, but what they do say is, we're not ready to turn over these forts because we think the Americans are in violation of the certain features of the treaty, and we're just going to hang on to them. There's another consideration, which is the British decide that, this new United States looks pretty weak. It looks like their union of states is going to unravel. They have embarked on a radical form of government, a republic, which has never been stable in history. Therefore, we think that in a very few years, their whole operation is going to collapse. So why should we give up these forts? Let's just kind of wait and see. And we expect it will unravel and we'll be left holding the forts and we will have mollified our Indian allies. And then there's a second thing that Native peoples put pressure on the British to do, which is to say, that peace treaty does not sacrifice Indian property rights. And that instead, the relevant line is not the peace treaty boundary through the Great Lakes and the Niagara River, but instead it's the Treaty of Fort Stanwix line. Now, that treaty had been negotiated in 1768. And you see the dark black line there that runs just to the east of the Finger Lakes. That's the Treaty of Fort Stanwix line. So the country to the east and south of that line had been conceded in 1768 by Haudenosaunee chiefs as settler country, whereas they'd reserved to themselves the country to the east and north of that line. So in May of 1783, the Haudenosaunee chiefs say to the British, you may have given up your claims to the east and the south of this new international boundary that you've created, but we haven't given up our claims to our homelands that are in between. And this impresses the British as an argument. And Haldeman says this to his superiors, they got a pretty good argument there, and that these people actually have very enlightened ideas of the nature and obligations of treaties, as the most civilized nations have. That no infringement of the Treaty of 1768 can be binding, I'm sorry, there's a typo there, upon them without their express concurrence and consent. So Native peoples like the Haudenosaunee have been dealing with European powers for centuries. And they've become quite sophisticated at understanding how treaties work. And they're trying to make them work for themselves. So the Haudenosaunee have done a couple of things in the spring of 1783 to defend their interests in their lands. The first is to compel the British to hang on to the forts. The second is to introduce this theory, quite a good theory, that they still own their homelands because they've not surrendered any of their homelands that are to the west and to the north of the Treaty of Fort Stanwix line. And indeed, the Haudenosaunee start to assert, you know what? We're independent. The British have cast us adrift in their peace treaty, but that makes us independent nations, and we can negotiate as independent nations now without any kind of British permission. So you can see here that Native peoples aren't taking this peace treaty and this apparent sacrifice of their homelands. They're not accepting it. They're resisting it. And they've done so in these two ways. And then there's a third way. And this man, Joseph Brant, Mohawk chief, who'd been a very successful leader of both loyalists and warriors on behalf of the British Alliance against the Americans during the Civil War we call the American Revolution. And after the war, he is very influential among the Haudenosaunee. He is himself Mohawk, but he is deeply respected because he's both literate and fluent in English. And so he has an especially deep understanding of how the British Empire works and how the new American Republic works. And this is an expertise that's very valuable to the Native peoples, Haudenosaunee, and other allies of theirs who live to the west. And in 1783, Brant starts to work for an Indian confederation that will unite the Six Nations as well as those Native peoples living to the west, people like the Ottawa, the Anishinabeg, Miami, the Ankashaws, Wyandotte, Lenni Lenape. All told, 35 Indian nations will enter into a confederation. And this shows the country that's involved. It's the lighter colored area, and some of the Native peoples are listed on there, but it also includes the Six Nations. And the principle of the treaty is that there have been no land cessions by any of these Native peoples subsequent to 1768. The Americans insisted there'd been some, but the Confederated nations say no. And they're committed to one core conviction, which is no individual nation of this confederation can sell any land to the Americans, that it's going to have to be by the unanimous consent of all of them, and that they are all committed to defending their homelands collectively. This too is something that is an Indian conception, is something that the British go along with because they see this as bolstering their own security and making Canada safer, because there'll be this broad Native American border zone between the Fort Stanwix line and this new international boundary line, so that the United States and the British Empire won't directly abut each other along that international boundary line, but instead there'll be this Indian buffer zone in between. And by providing weapons and ammunition to the Confederated natives, the British will help them to resist American expansion and to keep those American settlers far away from Canada and therefore unable to seize these British forts. So it's a package deal. The British fort retention, the Treaty of Fort Stanwix line being asserted as the most relevant line, and this creation of an Indian Confederation. Now, the man who is kind of the mastermind of the Americans starting to unravel this is Philip Schuyler. He's a New Yorker. He is a general during the Revolution. He had considerable expertise in negotiating with the Haudenosaunee. And he is very savvy and very committed ultimately to dispossessing the Haudenosaunee of their land so that they could become settled by Americans. Now, Schuyler recognizes that the United States of the 1780s does not have the military power to challenge the Indian Confederation or those British forts. The United States Army in the middle of the 1780s had shrunk to just 350 men. But Schuyler's got a scheme, and it's, in a way, it's counterintuitive to how we usually think about frontier relations. We usually think that Americans are just relentlessly trying to take over native land and push natives further and further west or further and further north. And in general, that's how it works out. But that's not how it worked out in the 1780s and early 1790s. What Schuyler is saying is that the Haudenosaunee have become refugees driven out of their homelands around the Finger Lakes during the war, and they're settled in the Niagara Valley or over in the Grand River Valley within Canada. And Schuyler says we actually don't want them there, because if they're there and a war breaks out, they'll be in a prime position to be armed by the British and to attack our settlements and to have a safe haven to go to. So what Schuyler wants to do is invite them to come home. Come back to your homelands. We want you to come back and settle around the Great Lakes and in the Genesee Valley and just south of Oneida Lake. Now, he's saying this in 1783, and he's doing this because what he's calculating on is that if they're drawn back into their homelands, then settlements will start to develop around them and will pin them down and render them vulnerable to the power of the settlers. And then those Haudenosaunee people will not be in a position to ally with the British in a new war. Now, these are the sorts of settlements that Philip Schuyler has in mind. And you can see that you can build these cabins and erect these fences and girdle the trees so that they'll die. And you can do this pretty quickly. And this is indeed what's going to happen to Native peoples, is this sort of landscape will start to develop around them. And Schuyler's calculated all of this. He's saying, this is what always happens to Native peoples once settlements start to encroach on not just on one frontier line, but around them, to enclose them, to narrow down their territory and their options. And he says, they'll just fade away then. And we won't even have to spend the money to buy out their rights. So Schuyler's many things, and one of them is quite calculating. And he's laying this out in 1783. Now, it turns out the Six Nations will divide. About 2/3 of them say, no, we don't trust Schuyler, we don't trust the Americans. We are going to stay here in the Niagara Valley, particularly at a place called Buffalo Creek, near the modern city of Buffalo. Or we're going to go over to Grand River and settle there with Joseph Brant and the Mohawks. But there were Haudenosaunee people who wanted to go home. And gender politics plays a role here. And here is a speech from the leading Cayuga women. The Cayuga are one of the Six Nations, a nation that historically had lived around Cayuga Lake. And they're explaining in 1789 why they want to go home. Because they felt that during the war, they'd lost power. That traditionally among the Haudenosaunee, there'd been a division of authority respected by three elements. One is the sachems, who are the more traditional chiefs, sometimes called the civil chiefs. The war chiefs, who tend to be younger and who are involved in organizing young men for war, and the matrons. And that on any major decision among the Haudenosaunee, all three elements had to line up. But during the war chiefs just did things the way they wanted to. They were the ones receiving presents, including weapons from the British, and that gave them clout. And they just basically started to tell the matrons and the sachems to stand aside. And they continued to do that during the 1780s, when the issue is, where shall we live? And shall we enter into any kind of understanding with the Americans? So this here, you get the Cayuga matrons saying, this isn't right. And we're going to go home, because if we stay here in the Niagara Valley, we're just going to be dominated by the war chiefs, people like Joseph Brant. So there are splits within the Haudenosaunee that the Americans will exploit. And about a third of the Haudenosaunee will return to live in their traditional homelands within the American border. And then they'll be subject to the environmental transformation that's wrought by settlers who are coming in by the thousands. So that by 1790, there are 10 settlers within the Haudenosaunee country for every Haudenosaunee person. And they are engaged in an environmental transformation that's quite vividly illustrated in this 19th century picture, which shows settlers chopping down trees and using them as firewood and using them to build log cabins in the background. And they are introducing domesticated livestock like the horses on the left, which means they need to clear more of the forest so that they can have pastures and hay fields. And so the landscape is opening up, and it's doing so in ways which is constricting the landscape that native peoples had exploited. And then they will be subjected to pressures from the state of New York, which is coming in and saying, basically, if you want to keep the peace, you're going to have to sell to us the lands that the settlers are already occupying. You can't hang on to them. The settlers will grab them. You might as well take some small payment from us, because otherwise you'll get nothing. So that by the early 19th century, the Haudenosaunee country has been whittled down to these reservations. In this case, it's just showing the Seneca reservations in westernmost New York, but the same thing has happened in the Finger Lakes just to the east. All of the native peoples have been pinned down by settlements all around them. And so what the Haudenosaunee had tried to do during the 1780s and early 1790s to preserve their homelands is to create a buffer zone in which they would live between the British and Canada and the Americans of the United States. And they would be free to run their own affairs and to retain their homelands in between. Instead, what they found was a steady erosion of their circumstances by the intrusion of thousands of settlers. So that instead of living in an open borderland, as they'd hoped, they live in a divided ground. And it's been divided in three interacting ways. First is the subdivision of most of their country into private property held by settlers. Then there are the boundary lines that have been drawn between that settler world and what is retained by the native peoples as reservations, which are relatively small pockets of their former homeland. This then enables the Americans to claim the ultimate dividing line, which is that international boundary line. In effect, they've erased the Fort Stanwix line, and by the middle of the 1790s, they have compelled the British, who've lost their Indian allies through this process, they've compelled the British to give up those forts. So that by 1796, the United States is in a dominant position in the Haudenosaunee country as a result of these three sets of divisions that have been imposed upon the Haudenosaunee through this process designed by Philip Schuyler and implemented by the state of New York and by its settlers during the 1780s and early 1790s. Thank you very much, and I will welcome any questions that you have.
So much history I didn't learn in school. And I'm curious, Alan, just as we start to get some questions from the audience, are there members of the Haudenosaunee today? Do they live on reservations? Have you been in contact with any of current peoples?
Yes, there are many Haudenosaunee people today. Some of them do live on reservations. There are the Tuscarora, for example, still have a significant reservation, and the Seneca do in westernmost New York. Now, there are ongoing contestation about what are the proper bounds of those reservations. So, for example, the Seneca claim that they never sold the islands, including Grand Island and the Niagara River, and they want those restored. Or the Oneida, who are of New York, who are in the process of buying up usually dairy farms that are out of business. And so they pay pretty good prices, and there are people willing to sell to the Oneida. But if you travel through upstate New York, through that country, you'll see a lot of billboards put up by angry people who do not want their neighbors to sell their farms to the Oneida. They don't want the Oneida Reservation to expand. And then there are lots of Haudenosaunee people who do not live on reservations. Some of your neighbors may be Haudenosaunee or other Native peoples. So we can have the illusion that Native peoples were all pushed off to the west or pushed off into Canada, or that they all live on reservations, but they don't. Most Native peoples of the United States don't live on reservations. The number one concentration of Native peoples in the United States is in Los Angeles, and there's no reservation there. So it's an interesting and complex situation in which Native peoples do retain some quasi-sovereign areas, which we call reservations, but they are also very much interwoven into American life.
I'm going to take questions first from the live audience, and we have a remote microphone for you to use. Raise your hand. No?
As I sit here, all I can do is think of the book, The Pioneers by David McCullough, taking a very different perspective on what happened, and wondering how the opening of the Northwest Territories played into the timeline that you just shared with us.
Yeah, I'm certainly not going to say anything negative about David McCullough, who's a wonderful man, and I know he's familiar to many of you in your community. And you're right that in his book, his focus is on the settler world and their accomplishments. So there's nothing that I've said that says, settlers didn't accomplish great things and didn't go through great hardships to accomplish them. And I've also written about that in my own book, William Cooperstown. But what I would encourage people to do is to think about the Native American experience side by side with the settler story, and to see there are consequences. The settlers are able to expand and do the things they did at the expense of Native peoples. And that's just our history. So I don't know if that's answering your question, but I'll be happy to, if there's another way that I can expand on.
A side way around it, because the granting of that territory through what I understood to be treaty and our own government didn't just play into your narration. I was just wondering how that if that fit in some way to.
Well, the Northwest Territory is the area west of where the Haudenosaunee lives. So I've focused on the Haudenosaunee because that's what I've written about in the divided ground. But you're quite right that the story can also be told about what happens in what is now Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois. And I would say it's a parallel process, except there, rather than the state of New York, it's the federal government that's negotiating with Indian peoples and parting them from their lands in a variety of treaties. The most important of these treaties is the Treaty of Grenville, which happens in 1795 in Ohio. The federal government was able militarily in 1794 to defeat the Indian Confederation and to dissolve it. And then they're able to negotiate with individual Indian nations to obtain the kind of land cessions they want. And that starts off a process that will continue thereafter. And the federal government, once it obtains Indian lands, and they tend to pay on the order of about 3 cents per acre to Native peoples. They then sell that to settlers, and the average price in Ohio or Indiana and Illinois in that period of time is $3 per acre. So this is a source of federal revenue, is to turn Indian lands over to settlers and to take a markup that the federal government can use to pay its national debt and to pay its ongoing operations. So the federal government is dependent upon this process of Indian dispossession, just as it expands the economic opportunity for its citizens by providing farms to them of this property that's been taken from Native peoples.
Thank you. You filled in the gap for me, and I appreciate
Right
it.
behind you, Ellen.
Hi there. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Mhm.
I'm just curious at the end, when you were talking about Schuyler's scheme of kind of weakening them and being overrun, and then was there ever, did the political entity of the Haudenosaunee ever actually change the treaty? Or was it just that they were overrun and slowly gave up their lands? I guess it's like, my question is, did
Yeah.
the actual tribal leadership ever officially cede or surrender the land?
Well, that depends on who you believe. In 1784, the United States held another Treaty of Fort Stanwix with certain Haudenosaunee representatives. Now, the Haudenosaunee representatives were war chiefs, and they went there. They were sent there without matrons and without sachems, with the conviction that these war chiefs can negotiate peace, but nothing else. So they can't cede any lands. They don't have the authority to do that. But the United States brought troops in and basically held those Haudenosaunee delegates hostage until they agreed to sign a document that basically said that they recognized the authority of the United States over them, and they would give up lands along the Niagara River so that the United States could come and take possession of Fort Niagara and the international boundary. As soon as these delegates, hostages, were released and went back home, their peoples all said that treaty's not binding. That was done in a very underhanded, violent way. We don't honor it. But the United States, ever since then, has said the Treaty of 1784 is a binding treaty. And now it's somewhat modified in 1794 by the Treaty of Canandaigua, where a federal government that was a bit more enlightened under the leadership of George Washington reaches a financial settlement of sorts with the Haudenosaunee. And in the 1794, they don't extort any more lands, but they insisted on, we do get to keep those Niagara Valley lands in federal control. So there's still a great deal of unhappiness among Haudenosaunee peoples over how they were treated in 1784, and they don't think that they, in fact, at that time, recognized the United States as sovereign over them. They much prefer the Treaty of Canandaigua in 1794.
We have a couple of questions on Zoom. Sarah?
Yes. What, if any, involvement of the federal government in this process you described in New York State?
Right. In New York State, not much, except I have laid out what they did in 1784. Because the land in New York State does not belong to the federal government. It belongs to New York State. Or I have to amend that a little bit. A big chunk of it belongs to Massachusetts because of a deal Massachusetts and New York made in 1786. So that the lands in westernmost New York had actually been given to Massachusetts, but New York gets legal jurisdiction. So they get to run the government there, but Massachusetts gets to sell the lands there. So what they did was they sold it to a couple of wheeler dealers named Phelps and Gorham, who were politicians, very successful politicians, and they had the money to give Massachusetts a payment price right up front because Massachusetts is desperate for money in the 1780s. So Phelps and Gorham buys up Massachusetts' claim, and then they are basically working away to try to enforce what was called their preemption right to westernmost New York. And they are supported by the state government of New York, and they're also supported by the federal government in that. But the federal government does not reap any revenue from the sale of lands within the state of New York. That's reaped either by Phelps and Gorham, or it's reaped by the state of New York, which is selling the lands around the Finger Lakes and Oneida Lake.
Sarah, another question?
Yes. How do the 1780s and the 1790s events that you discussed today interface with or into the War of 1812?
Well, the United States, as I said, in 1796, gets control over the international boundary, and they occupy the fort at Niagara. When there's a renewed war with the British that starts in June of 1812, the Americans put pressure on the Haudenosaunee living on their side of the border, including the various Haudenosaunee nations living around Buffalo Creek, but also the Oneida and the Cayuga and the Seneca. And they basically say, we expect you to help us in this war. Meanwhile, the British are saying the same thing to the Haudenosaunee who happen to live on their side of the border over in Grand River. We expect you to help us. And both sides are arming the Haudenosaunee. Now, the Haudenosaunee tried to keep from being pitted in direct combat with one another. But that will break down in 1814 with very tragic consequences in which Haudenosaunee people are killing each other. Some is on the British, are serving the British side, and some are on the American side. So that's a negative consequence of this divided ground in which the Haudenosaunee have been divided by an international boundary line and put under the pressure of being constricted within reservations by all of these farms held by settlers.
Do we have more questions in the room? Over here?
Thank you so much. Okay, thank you so much. I'm curious, moving into the future, Deb Haaland, the Secretary of the Interior, has made great strides in Indian country. And I know 1,000 acres was recently given back to, I believe, was it the Onondaga tribe? Of contaminated homelands, which they're going to take charge of. Is there money associated with that? And do you see this happening in other parts of the nation?
I don't know the particular case that you mentioned, whether there's been funding that's been provided to them. My guess is yes, but again, that's my guess. Is this playing out elsewhere around the country? In some ways, yes. No. So one thing that Deb Haaland has done is initiated a process to investigate Indian boarding schools and the treatment of the young people at those schools. Now, historians have been exploring this for a while, but there hasn't been a systematic combing through of federal records to understand exactly the scale of the loss of life at this. Now, this was a process that the Canadians are a bit ahead of us on. And there have been some shocking revelations from that process. So Native peoples within the United States are saying, well, we need to do a similar process to understand that here. Also relevant is the Supreme Court decision a few years ago saying basically a lot of lands were taken from the native nations of Oklahoma unjustly. And there has to be some compensation, major compensation to them for that. So there's ongoing legal challenges to the treaties that were imposed on Native peoples. And, treaties are things that both bind Native peoples, but they also usually underline the ongoing sovereignty of Native nations, so that natives are not purely dissolved just of their tribal governments or their sovereignty and dissolved into the mass of the American public. They have treaty rights, as well as those treaties having extorted things from them. So Native peoples are in the position of trying to use their treaty rights to recover lands that were taken from them that are beyond what they had agreed to give up in those treaties. And that's how it's playing out in Oklahoma, and that's how it may play out with the Seneca and their claim to the islands in the Niagara River.
Other questions in the room? Can we pass the microphone to?
My question is, when Andrew Jackson ordered Native Americans west of the Mississippi, and the Cherokees were so affected, were the Native Americans up in your area affected? Did they force them to go?
Yeah, they weren't. I mean, most of the Native peoples removed during Jackson's presidency were removed from southern states, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida in particular. Something on the order of 3/4 of the natives removed. But there were natives who were removed from the upper Midwest. The process was especially violent in the South, especially in Alabama and Georgia, where federal troops were sent in to round up Native peoples and force them out. And in Florida, where there was a prolonged war with the Seminoles. There is some violence in the Midwest, particularly in Illinois and Wisconsin, where the Sauk and the Fox resist. And there's effort. There's a treaty that's made at Buffalo Creek in 1838 by the state of New York under federal auspices that induces some of the Haudenosaunee to move westward. But most of the Haudenosaunee, and some of them went to Wisconsin, and some would go on to what is now Kansas or Oklahoma. Others stayed up in Canada, but always many Haudenosaunee people clung to what was left of their reservations in Western New York. So the era of removal, which means the late 1820s and the 1830s, is one that does negatively impact the Haudenosaunee. But it does not completely drive them out of their homelands in the same way that, say, almost all of the Cherokee or the Muskogean peoples were driven out in the South.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
We have a couple more questions on Zoom that we're going to take now.
How did the Johnson versus McIntosh Supreme Court 1838 decision affect the treaties?
I'm trying to just remember that particular ruling, so you may know more about it than I do. Is that the one where John Marshall refers to dependent nations in a treaty relationship with the United States and involves the Cherokee? Or is that a different treaty?
Can the Zoom questioner answer that through the QA function? We may not know. We don't
Okay.
know in the room here.
I will just answer for the treaty that I do know that involves not treaty, the judicial decision of the Supreme Court, which is where the Marshall Court, Chief Justice John Marshall, rules that the state of Georgia had unjustly imposed its laws over the Cherokee when the Cherokee were in fact in a treaty relationship as a subordinate dependent nation on the United States with the United States, and that the United States had not entered any treaties that had exposed the Cherokee to Georgia state law. And Georgia was using the imposition of their law basically to dispossess Native peoples and to destroy their tribal government and to arrest white people from New England, and including Samuel Worcester, who came from Massachusetts and was a missionary down there, for helping the Cherokee. So Marshall makes his ruling, and legend has it, and it is a legend, it's not true, that Andrew Jackson says, well, Chief Justice Marshall has made his ruling, now let him enforce it. It wasn't, in fact, a ruling against the federal government, it was a ruling against the state of Georgia. And the state of Georgia just ignores it, and the federal government does nothing to enforce it. So in point of fact, the Supreme Court had tried to protect the Indian nation of the Cherokee in this judicial decision and failed.
More questions in the room? One over here.
Thank you. As someone who was educated in the Midwest, in Missouri in the 60s, and in the Northwest Territories in the late 1960s in college, in fact, the college that was named after the Northwestern Territories, my question is, what is your evaluation of how education in high schools and colleges around the United States, our education is changing to reflect the Native American peoples and their role in history? And what's your view about the future of that kind of education? In other words, what I'm saying is that very little of what you have been telling me is at all familiar.
Right. Well, I would say that education in K-12, particularly in high school, about Native American experience is better, significantly better than it was 20 or 30 years ago. But I don't think we're in the promised land on that. And as I'm sure you all know, the teaching of American history has become politically very contentious, particularly over any issue involving race. And there's a lot of pushback against changing how American history has been taught. Certainly in changes involving the African-American experience have become very controversial. But there's also pushback in many places about telling the story of Indian dispossession. People prefer to have the story of the first Thanksgiving in which people are all getting along. So it would be nice if the teaching of American history were separated from politics, but I don't expect that to happen because, in fact, political contestation over the teaching of American history has steadily increased in my lifetime, particularly in the last 8 years, and even more so in the last 5 years. So there are going to be a lot of battles on school boards, and the people who oppose changing American history to reflect a fuller understanding of Native American and African American experience are very active in trying to control school boards through elections, which is their democratic right to do. And it puts teachers in a tough spot, though, because they are under greater restrictions than ever before on what they can teach in many states. Now, it's my belief that Massachusetts is a pretty good state at allowing teachers some leeway in what they teach, but there are states, and I don't need to name them. I think they're in the news, and you're familiar with them, where teachers are under increasing restriction about what they can teach. So this is going to be a contest, as far as I can see into the future.
Depressing, concerning. More questions in the room? One over here.
Thank you for your presentation. I worked on a documentary for WGBH on a project called We Shall Remain, about the 5 parts on remaining.
Okay, I can just barely hear you. If it's
Oh.
possible to be a little
Yeah.
louder, that would help.
Is this better?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
better.
Yeah, I was just saying, I had worked on a documentary on, produced by WGBH American Experience, called We Shall Remain. It was a 5-part series. And one of the things that really struck me was how the epidemics figured into our ability to get a foothold in this country. And I was curious about how the Six Nations were affected by the rolling epidemics that started in the 1600s or possibly earlier.
Yeah.
And how that played into what subsequently happened. So just like your thoughts on that.
I could just interject that we are going to have a whole program about epidemics in a couple of sessions, but let's hear what Alan has to say about this territory.
Okay, I'll try not to say too much because you're going to have a real expert, and I don't want to say anything that might be too wrong. I think it is there is a scholarly consensus that the native population in North America was very large, much larger than used to be thought, and that the introduction of diseases from Europe that were new to native peoples. Now, native peoples had diseases, of course, of their own. They didn't live forever before 1492, but there are some devastating new diseases that apparently native peoples have not been exposed to before, such as smallpox. And it's believed by most scholars that over the course of the first century of exposure to these diseases, the native population will decline dramatically because deaths exceed births. Now, there's also the role of violence in their world, but that epidemic diseases kill many more people than does warfare during that first century of encounter. Now it's a kind of a rolling century because people in the Pacific Northwest don't bear the brunt of these diseases until the later 18th century, when they first start to encounter Europeans in a major way. Whereas in New England, this impact is in the first 2 or 3 decades of the 17th century. And so when the so-called pilgrims arrive to colonize in the town of Plymouth, Massachusetts, they find empty native villages and cleared fields, and they can just move in and occupy them. And this makes their life a hell of a lot easier. And they can do this because the local Pokanoket and Wampanoag peoples had been so depleted that they consolidated and moved out of that particular location. Now the Haudenosaunee, they're affected by this. Our numbers are just estimates, but it's thought that probably in about the year 1600, or within what is now New York State, there probably were about 50,000 Haudenosaunee people. And by 1750, there's only about 10,000. And they've been bolstered somewhat by warfare, in which they captured a fair number of people and adopted them to recoup some of their population losses to disease. So they're very hard hit, no question about it. But they're not as hard hit probably as the native peoples along the New England coast were. Again, it's a difference of degree, not of kind. So I don't want to say Haudenosaunee were exempt from this. They're very hard hit by it. But they're in a somewhat stronger position to recover somewhat from it than were the native peoples along the coast of New England.
We have another question on Zoom.
Following up on the earlier question, Johnson versus McIntosh concerned who had the right to own the land. The court ruled that the savages, quote unquote, could not own land per doctrine of discovery.
Again, I'm not particularly familiar with that particular Supreme Court decision, so I will avoid saying anything about it.
And we will hear a lot about the doctrine of discovery in our very next lecture. So maybe that's a question we can raise again then. Deidre?
Thank you so much, Alan. I just want to get back to our state of K-12 education, and just as a point of information for the audience, we came to work with Alan, and he so generously gave our time to us today through the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, which the Hingham Historical Society began working with thanks to David McCullough. But Alan spent a week this past June Zooming with over 150 middle and high school students throughout the United States who had the benefit of his insights for a whole seminar. And he also did a course with the Gilder Lehrman Master's program, which is eligible to middle and high school social studies teachers throughout the world, actually. So I just want to thank Alan, because I know you're working every year to improve U.S. education on this topic, and we're very grateful.
Well, I'm very grateful to you folks for working with Gilder Lehrman, and to Gilder Lehrman, which if folks are not familiar with it, it's well worth going on their website to learn what they're doing, because they're making a major investment in supporting teachers and at showing a comprehensive history of the United States. And there are wonderful people involved with this. I'm just one of many people, and by no means the most important person involved in Gilder Lehrman. And they do a lot on African American history, history of slavery, and they're increasingly doing stuff about Native American history. But they do a wonderful job of encouraging students to take a leadership position in teaching. So I attended an annual event for them in New York City, and all of the speakers giving presentations of awards were students, and they were wonderfully articulate, largely from the New York City school districts, but they work with students and teachers around the whole country. And so again, I said some fairly pessimistic things about the nature of American education, but one thing that I'm very optimistic about is the Gilder Lehrman Institute and the work that they do.
And they do many programs that the public can partake of over Zoom as well.
Yep.
So, just check them out. Any more questions on Zoom?
No.
And in the room, more questions? One back here.
Hi there. Listening to you talk about the coercion of the war chiefs into ceding the land just brought to mind Putin's referendums in occupied Ukraine, as well as you talked about how I'm saying the name wrong, end up fighting against each other. Also reminded me of Ukrainians being conscripted with the draft to fight against Ukrainians, and I just want to know, is there anything else that, as you watch the news of the domination of Ukraine, is there anything else in that story that reminds you of classic colonization of what happened on this land?
I understand your points, and I don't disagree with them. But I also don't want to say it's exactly the same, the two situations, in that Ukraine is doing a remarkable job of defending themselves, and much better than I think outside observers, or maybe even Ukrainians, expect they would, given the apparent power of the Russian state. So, and these are very modern wars with very modern weapons indeed. But there are certainly situations in history which involve, and there's you could say it's a pretty consistent pattern, that when you're in any kind of war that has a civil war dimension to it, there are efforts to politically divide the civilian population that you're trying to occupy in order to better control them. And you can see patterns like that in American expansion in North America. You can see it in Russia and Ukraine. But again, I don't want to exaggerate the differences. There are, in human history, there are terrible things all over the globe. And by no means am I saying that the United States or Americans have some sort of monopoly on this. It's certainly not true. But there are terrible things that happen in the United States, and like the removal of the Cherokee or the manipulation of the Haudenosaunee in order to get their lands, and we need to know about them.
Thank you. More questions in the room? Anything on Zoom? Thank you so much, Alan.
Thank you. Thank you.
What an auspicious start to our series. These are serious questions, so much we don't know, and you've certainly increased our awareness, given us a lot to think about, certainly created, in my mind, more hunger to learn more, and we hope to help with that process in the programs that follow. But Alan, it's been a treat to hear you today. It's a real honor for the Hingham Historical Society to have you lead off this program for us. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
I want to invite everyone in the audience to join us on November 6th for the second program in this series, Native Homelands, Settler Colonialism. And you'll hear from Robert Miller, who is a professor at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University. He will share his deep knowledge of the European doctrine of discovery, how it was reflected in charters of the British colonies, such as the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And some of the questions that came up today, I think, can be amplified when we talk with Professor Miller. So looking forward to that. Finally, I want to invite those of you with us at the museum today to join us for some light refreshments downstairs on the second floor. We thank all of you who joined us online today. And one more thank you to Sarah and to Colin for being behind the scenes, making things work here, and to our hardworking education committee that began working on this series many months ago to bring this all to fruition. So many thank yous, and look forward to meeting some of you downstairs. This concludes our Zoom program. Thank you.